Hi, I'm pastry chef Maria Kemp from Beyond Decadence. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm here to celebrate Juneteenth, and I hope you are too as well. What I want to show you in this celebration is how to make a bourbon sweet potato pie with marshmallow meringue. The historical connection that I will be using throughout this demonstration will talk about desserts that were popular during slave times, and for the items they didn't have back then, what they could use instead. So I hope you're ready. Let's get started. Look at this sweet potato. This is huge. We only need 2 pounds for our pie, so this would probably be enough right here. But I think we'll go with something a little bit smaller. One of the most important things about the sweet potatoes is sweet potatoes have the orangish brown exterior. These little strings, we won't worry about those. And if we were to cut it open, we would see that the flesh inside is orange. So these are definitely sweet potatoes and not yams. And these are what the slaves were most used to. They were used to actually yams, but sweet potatoes were the substitute that they came to use in the New World. And in African, a sweet potato is called, a yam is called a yami. I'm probably not saying it exactly right, but it has N-Y-A-M-I, and that's what a yam was called in African. But we know these as sweet potatoes, and this is what we'll be using for our pie. Okay, first of all, we're making a sweet potato pie, not a yam pie, so don't you dare call them yams. What we have are sweet potatoes, and you can see they have a reddish brown exterior. If I cut them open, they're orange in the inside, where yams are brown exterior, rougher and paler on the inside. So there's a big difference between the two. Before we get started, one of the first things we want to do is we want to wash them, because we don't want dirt in our sweet potato pie. So I'm going to go to the sink, turn on the water, and I have my little brush, and I'll give it a little scrub. Now, I want you to wash yours longer than that. I've already pre-washed these. And then I have a little rack here that I'll put them on to dry. Now, I'll give this a little help to speed it up just a little bit. Now, like I said, just in case you're tuning in a little late, the other ones are already pre-washed, so we're not going to worry about those. And then the trick is wrapping them in foil. Now, if you want to get a big piece of foil and rip it, you're more than welcome to do that. But I'm going to start with these pop-up pieces. And I'll put the sweet potato, remember it's a sweet potato, not a yam, in here. Roll it down, and then tuck the ends around. And then I have my little tray here. Isn't this the cutest little sheet pan ever? It's a 1/4 of a sheet pan with a piece of parchment. Because when you cook your sweet potatoes in the oven, a lot of times when they start to roast, then the juices leak out, and then it creates a big mess. So if you have the parchment paper and have them wrapped in foil to help keep the moisture in so they don't dry out, then that will help you be more successful and help the cleanup be less. Now, let's talk about a little bit about the historical connection with this as I'm wrapping these. Back in the slave days, they didn't have sweet potatoes in Africa. They had yams, so they were familiar with yams. That was the root vegetable that they were most familiar with. Let's go ahead and stick these in the oven so they can get roasting. Now we're making a bourbon sweet potato pie today, but I want to tell you, it didn't start as dessert. We know that as one of our favorite desserts today, but let's roll back the clock to history right now and talk about what was popular then. So sweet potatoes were first a savory dish. Slaves were cooking those in the ashes of the fire, wrapped in leaves, and they were spicing them. So they were savory, whatever spices they had access to for the day that they may have grown on their land, that in the little gardens that they had, or maybe they were able to get access to from the plantation owner. So they started as a savory dish. We didn't add sugar until much later. So some of the desserts that were popular back then were ash cake, challah cake, or sometimes it was just a piece of cornbread with molasses on top, or it could have been fruit. So nothing like we have available today. So you might be wondering, where did recipe books come from? Well, that's a great question. What was happening back then was called a receipt book, and that was the female slave owner who would write down the ingredients and the measurements that their slaves were using as they were cooking food or desserts in what they called the big house, which was the plantation owner's home at the time. So they were called receipt books, and now we call them recipe books. Now let's talk about some of the ingredients. We're going to go to use a term that's a French term called mise en place, which means to set in place. So that means we're going to prepare all of the ingredients by washing them, prepping them, measuring them, so they're ready to go and ready to add into our recipe. So we don't get halfway through a recipe and realize we're out of evaporated milk. Not that that happened to me or anything. But the first thing we'll start with is our sweet potatoes. Our sweet potatoes, we talked about the sweet potatoes are sweet potatoes and not yams. And so we've got those. And so we know that they would have had those available back then, and that they were savory to start with, not sweet. And we have sugar, which I think has been around since the beginning of time. So the slaves probably had access to some form of sugar. We know that they didn't have access to brown sugar. That came much later. And evaporated milk. That's a possibility. They did have milk, but evaporated milk is where 60% of the water has been removed, so probably not. And then let's talk about the funnest ingredients, the bourbon in its little indescript bottle. Now, we know that they didn't have access to bourbon, depending upon the plantation that they lived on and in the part of the country it was. So, little interesting fact is house slaves did brew alcohol for their plantations. It was usually the female slaves. Don't know why, but that's who it usually was. So they may have brewed beer, brandy, rum, just whatever, depending upon where the plantation was located, what made sense for that part of the country. But typically, alcohol wasn't permitted to be consumed by the slaves unless the owners gave them permission, certain holidays or for the owner's entertainment. That's plain and simple. So let's move forward a little bit and talk about the rest of the ingredients. We have butter. Now I've browned the butter. And then we have spices ranging from cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, salt, and vanilla. So probably not available to the slaves, especially back in their slave quarters, unless they stole them from the big house, which was a possibility, or if that spice was something they could have grown in their little plot next to the slave quarters where they had gardens typically. You might say, slaves had gardens? Why did they have gardens? The slaves had animals? Well, yeah, they did, because rations were handed out by the slave owners on a weekly or monthly basis. And you think, well, they were getting food, so why would they need to grow anything? Well, it's a great thought, but the reason they did is those rations were not sufficient. They would get meat, they might get some sort of salted meat, salt pork or salt herring. Salted meat was very popular back then. Lard, and for sugar, they would get molasses. So it was very scarce. Now, depending upon the plantation, where they lived, they might have gotten a few more things in their ration, weekly or monthly, but they had to supplement. So that's what brings us to where we're at today. The sweet potatoes are ready. These look so good. Now the way that you can tell if they're done is you pierce them with a fork, and the fork should go all the way through the flesh. So that way you know that they're ready. So here are our sweet potatoes. Oh my goodness. They smell so good. I wish we had smell-o-vision and you could smell them. They just smell so deep and fragrant, and they even smell a little bit sweet, even though there's no sugar or brown sugar on them yet, but they smell so good. So all I've done is I've roasted them. We know they're done because the fork pierced them and they were leaking juice all over the place, so we know that they're ready and they're roasted. And you might say, well, why did you roast them? I thought for sweet potato pie, my grandma, she always boiled them. Well, some people will boil them, some people will not fry them, some people will boil them, some people will use an air fryer, but baking brings out the most flavor, and you don't lose the flavor from them from boiling them and all the moisture and just all the sweet potato goodness. So once we've done that, then we use our masher. And back in slave times, they probably didn't have a masher. You know what they did? They were ingenious. They used whatever worn out farm tools were available to them. And that's what they used to get through their everyday life, or things that they could have made. So we're just going to mash them. And you might say, well, where were the slaves doing all of their cooking? Well, in each slave quarter, they had a fireplace. You might think, wow, that's kind of cool. They had a fireplace. Well, you have to put it into perspective. The slave quarters were about 30 by 16, and they house 8 to 10 people, and there was a dirt floor, and people slept on pallets, so not as luxurious as we may be thinking. And they cooked over an open flame. There may have been a kettle and a device called a spider, and I read that first when I was researching, like, a spider, are we talking bugs and creepy crawlies? No, it's a 3-legged frying pan that they would put over the open flame. It could sit down in the flame. So those were just some of the things that they were using to cook, and then the big kettle. Now, depending upon the time of the year, they may have cooked inside the slave quarters, or they may have cooked outside. And you see a lot of pictures with somebody standing and stirring a big kettle of something over an open flame, obviously outdoors. So our sweet potatoes are ready, and we're very excited so we can move forward. And you might ask, well, okay, if they had sweet potatoes available then, were they eating them all as soon as they got them? Great question. Nope, not necessarily. Each slave quarter had underneath it, they dug it themselves, it was called a root cellar. So they could store valuable possessions, they could store salted meats, they could store a variety of things in the root cellar. The root cellar was typically next to the fireplace, so that way during the winter it helped keep the items warm and kept them from freezing. And sweet potatoes were one of the things that were stored in the root cellar. Okay, so back to our pie crust. So right before the pie went in the oven, after it sat in the refrigerator and the dough chilled, and we rolled it out and maneuvered it into the pie pan, we put it in the pan, and we used a fork to prick the crust. And the reason you use that to prick actually the raw dough is to allow air to get underneath it so it can breathe, to help it, to prevent it from puffing up so much. You don't want the crust to puff. And so you prick the bottom and you prick the sides, and that's where you can go along the side with a delicate little pattern using your fork. Now back then they didn't have crimpers. They probably used their fingers and crimped it, or they were just using their fingers. But we can use a fork, or we can use different tools. I always stay with a very simple pattern around the edge, because I'm going to show you a little trick that we're going to use when we bake it. And if we get too fancy with the edges, then it won't work because it won't fit. So anyway, this crust has been baked. I had already pricked it while the dough was raw, and now it's ready for the pie filling. It's time to make the pie filling. So we've been going through this whole process of bourbon, sweet potato pie. So now it's time to make the bourbon sweet potato pie filling. So I have all the ingredients here together. And you may say, when I was creating or baking the sweet potatoes, you're like, my grandmama, she didn't bake them. She boiled them in a big pot of water, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, a lot of people did that. And a lot of people are using air fryers now. They're grilling them. They're doing all sorts of creation because, let's admit it, baking sweet potatoes and that portion is like the most painful, for lack of a better word, part of the whole experience because they're hot and then you're trying to peel them. And guess what? After you go through all that baking or cooking or boiling or whichever method you choose, you have to let them cool down first. You can't use them while they're hot. You have to let them cool first. And you might think, well, what about all those strings that you get in the sweet potatoes? I didn't see you do anything with the strings. You know what? You're right. I didn't, because we're going to use a modern invention of the 21st century called the food processor. And that's going to make everything smooth and homogeneous. And if there's any strings in there, they're going to get blended into a million little pieces you'll never taste. So that is one of our tricks for today. So I've got the sweet potatoes, which I'm going to go ahead and put in the food processor. So let's go back to our historical connection. We know that they had sweet potatoes back in slave times, but they were doing a lot of their main cooking, little known fact, one pot cooking, and it was called sofki. Now, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong because I didn't Google the pronunciation first, but it's S-O-F-K-I. And that's where they had all these one-pot meals. So a lot of times when you're looking at this historical pictures, you're seeing somebody standing over a big pot and stirring it. They threw everything in those pots. I mean, they added whatever, anything and everything, and just kept adding to them, and that's what they did. Obviously, we know they didn't have food processors back then, so they were mixing everything by hand with whatever was available. So I'm going to go ahead and put on the lid to the food processor, and so far I've just got the sweet potatoes in. I'm going to give them a little mix first, if I remember how to put the lid on. There we go. Guess what? All those sweet potato strings are gone. And as we keep adding stuff to it, they're going to be gone even further. So what I'm going to do next is most recipes call for butter. And we know they had butter back then, but they probably didn't have brown butter. Brown butter is just a beautiful aroma where it brings out the nuttiness of it. Now you see it's a little brown, hence the name brown butter, not burnt butter. That would be not good. So this is brown butter. And I've let it cool. And I'm going to go ahead and add it to the food processor while it's running. And I like adding it in at this step so it mixes in with the sweet potatoes and doesn't end up being a layer of butter riding on top of everything. So I'm going to turn the motor on and I'm going to try not to spill it. And I'm going to stop to show you. Can you see all these little brown bits? Those are the little bits of browned where the butter was browned when I melted it over medium-high heat and just kept cooking it until it browned and not burnt. So I'll go ahead and add this last little piece in, and I'll turn the motor back on here in a second. But that's just going to add a depth of flavor, and you'll be able to taste it when you eat this pie. That was one of the first things I noticed when I ate it. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can taste that brown butter, and it is magnificent. So I'm going to try and get as much in it as possible of the little brown bits. And I have some other things to pour down the chute. So if you're saying, well, you have half of it around the chute and not getting down into the mix, that's okay, because I'm not done yet. So I'll put that there for now and give it a little. Okay, and it speeds up from here. So I can't take this off because then the blade will move, but you can see it's looking pretty smooth, and the butter is all mixed in. It's not riding on top of the sweet potatoes. Now at this point it gets easy. I can just start putting everything in except for the liquids. So I'll go ahead and put in the brown sugar And we talked about brown sugar. They probably didn't have that back then. White sugar. And then our spices. I've got cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, and a little bit of clove, a little bit of salt for good luck. What recipe doesn't use salt? And then a little bit of vanilla. Now I use vanilla paste, and so you can actually see the seeds. All those little dots are going to add so much vanilla goodness to this pie. And I encourage you to invest in decent spices from a spice purveyor, because it will elevate your baking and your cooking for that matter to a whole new level. So I can go ahead and put in the eggs. And we know they had eggs because they were raising animals. Now usually I would pre-crack these so I don't crack them over this, but I'm watching and I didn't get any yolks in. So things are looking up today, or any shell in, so things are looking up today. Okay, now all the ingredients are in the food processor, so we can put this little guy in if we want to, just to keep things from splattering up, and we'll turn it on. Safety first. Now that that's mixing up, we can go ahead and start to drizzle in the bourbon. And I just like to do the liquids last, so everything else mixes up first. And then I'll go ahead and put in the evaporated milk. And now I'm going to turn it off and take a look and see how we're doing. It looks like there's a lot along the side that I need to invite into the party that didn't get mixed in, and that's okay. So back with our historical connection, I'm going to try and get the rest of this brown butter out of here too, because that's just nutty goodness we want to be in our pie, not left behind in the container. Is they would have mixed everything by hand. I don't even remember what year electric mixers came out, but thank God that they did. And the food processor is a stroke of genius, because you just put everything in here and mix it up. Some people put everything in all at once. I like to leave the milk and the liquids to last, but if you want to mix them all at once, you can. Just make sure the lid is locked. And that's it. So any of you who were going through the long and arduous task of trying to get all the strings out of the sweet potatoes, you have fun with that. I use the food processor, and it takes care of all that for me. So the next thing I'll do is I will go ahead and pour this in the pie crust. And you unlock it and lift it off. Then you can move it out of the way. And I put my finger underneath the bottom to try and hold the blade so the blade doesn't fall out into my mixture. And you may have more filling than fits in the crust, so don't overfill it. If you wanted to do a deep dish pie and use a bigger shell, you could, but it would change the baking time. So I'm just giving this a little smooth, and then I will set this aside. Okay, so the pie is in the pan now, and I just used my spatula just to smooth it. You may say, Maria, they didn't have a fancy little high heat temperature spatula like you have that's probably imported. You know, you're right. They didn't. They probably didn't. They didn't have utensils either. So they just used whatever was available. They used a lot of shells, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. So I've got it smooth. And then the reason I said I didn't do a fancy little fluted edge on there was because if I do that, it may be too big that this handy dandy pie shield doesn't work. Now, of course, they didn't have pie shields back then. This came out much later. But let me tell you, if you want to do the aluminum foil method around the edge to keep the edge from browning or burning, be my guest. But a lot of the ovens we have today have fans because they're convection, and you try and put the foil around it and put it in an oven with the fan blowing. It doesn't work. It ends up in all around the oven or in your filling. So what I do is I use this pie shield. You could probably get these off of Amazon. And I give it a little spray of oil. You might say that was a lot. Well, okay, a lot. And then I use my finger and I rub it all around. Be generous because you want to get it in the crease and all around the inside edge. And you might say, but why? Well, because if you don't, when your pie finishes baking, this will be stuck to the baked filling and it will not come off. So you want to be generous with the oil, and then you can get a handy dandy paper towel and wipe off a little bit of the excess. Now don't wipe it all off, but just some of the excess. I just use olive oil spray. I think it's olive oil or canola spray. It's what I've had forever. You can use whatever spray you want. And then I take that and I fit it right down on the pie. And that's why if you do the fancy edges, the shield may not fit. So now our pie is ready to go into the oven. Okay, now it's time to put our pie in the oven. So we've got the oven set on 375 degrees. And we'll set a timer for 15 minutes, and then we're going to lower the temperature to 350 degrees and finish baking it for approximately another 30 minutes. Now, the nice thing about the pie is you'll know it's done because it's actually going to puff up, and it's going to puff up inside of the ring. And when we jiggle it slightly, it should have very little jiggle to it. Now, there can be a little, but not a lot, and then it will finish setting up when it cools. So that's how we'll know our pie is done. Now, a couple of key things in order to be successful in getting the meringue to turn, the egg whites to turn into meringue, is you have to start with a super clean bowl. So I've wiped the bowl with vinegar on the inside, and I've wiped the beaters with vinegar to remove any residue or any fat from either one of those items, and they're room temperature. And I have ingredients here that will go into it. I have salt, a little bit of salt, and then a little bit of cream of tartar, which is an acid, and then I have sugar, which I will add very slowly and at the appropriate time. Then in the bowl next to it, I have the marshmallow cream. So this is just the stuff that you buy at the store, which we know they would not have had access to back then, and all my fancy little tools of the century that I love. So let's go ahead and get started. Now that they're nice and foamy, you see they're getting a lot of volume because they were warm egg whites and the cream of tartar. And there were just 3 egg whites in there to begin with. I can add the sugar, but I'm only going to add a teaspoon at a time. Because if you add the sugar too soon, it will take forever for them to whip and to get stiff. And you want to make sure that sugar is fully incorporated. So I'm not going to rush the process. Okay, let's see how we did. Ooh, look at those nice little peaks. Do you see the little peaks? It looks like peaks of a mountain. They stand up straight when I pull the mixer up, and they're straight on the end of the mixer. So those are stiff peaks. They're still glossy and shiny. They're not dry looking or broken. So now here's where the fun part comes in. That's sarcasm, not really. But it's getting close to the having our marshmallow meringue for our pie. So now we take the spatula and we're going to take it and we're going to fold it into the marshmallow cream. This is just an extra sticky spatula that's in the way. So I will take it about a half a cup at a time. You're just going to have to eyeball it. And at first it's going to be sticky and gooey and messy, and you're not going to think you're making any progress. But just stick with it. As more of the egg white gets incorporated into the marshmallow cream, it will get less sticky and gooey. And sticky and gooey are very technical cooking terms or baking terms. Not really. So I'm just folding. I'm folding gently. I'm cutting through the center and then sweeping around the side. And that we know fancy tools like I'm using today were not prevalent back in those historical times. But they were not making meringue back then either. So now, one of the sweeteners I wanted to mention that they used back then was molasses. They did get sugar from the slave owners when they got their weekly or monthly rations, but they also got molasses, so they used molasses as a sweetener. Now, that doesn't mean you could replace molasses one-to-one for all the sugar and things that we have in the pie, but that is a sweetener that was used back then. So if we were making this pie back in the slave era, it would probably look a lot different. First of all, it wouldn't have a crust. See how this is getting easier? And we know everything started savory and just spiced and cooked over open flames, wrapped in leaves from greens, down in the ashes of the fire, or they were cooking over the fire, the pits, in the little kitchens they had in the slave quarters that were shared by 8 to 10 people that we talked about earlier. So we've almost got all this in. And it is getting considerably easier to stir now, or to fold. Folding and stirring are totally different, so I want to make sure I use the right term. And then we put the last little bit in and get that bowl out of the way. So, that's how easy it is to make marshmallow meringue. So now, here comes the fun part. Here's our baked pie. And I'm going to dollop or put billowy heaps, there's another technical term for you, over the chilled pie. So this pie has been baked and it's been chilled in the refrigerator. So it's nice and cold. And back to the people who say, well, we always boil our sweet potatoes. This is another reason using boiled sweet potatoes would not work to your advantage, because they would have too much water, and the water can rise to the top, the surface of the pie, and make it watery, and then your marshmallow meringue may not marshmallow meringue correctly. And that would be very sad after all the work we've put into creating this pie. Now you can be as artistic as you want with this pie. You can see that's a lot of meringue. I don't think we need every single drop of it on there on the pie. I'm putting it around the edges to seal the edges of the pie. And the thing about using the meringue, as delicious as it's going to be, is you don't want to put it on before you're going to eat it, because a meringue is not going to keep for a really long time. So obviously we're going to dig into this pie today while the meringue is still marshmallowy good. Okay, so I think that's enough on there to my liking. And then from there, I'm just going to use the spatula and try and get some little peaks like I did when I was beating the meringue. And then we'll put it in the oven to toast. And we're only going to leave it in there for about 5 minutes or until it starts to toast. Now, toast is not synonymous with burn, charred to a crisp. It means the little peaks that I did, the little points, they should pick up the color first because they're going to be, they're the littlest piece. So now we'll go ahead and put this in the oven. Okay, our pie is ready, so let's go ahead and get it out of the oven. So the marshmallow meringue should have nice little brown areas toasted on the peaks. And it does. Look at that. That looks spectacular. Like I said, depending on how you roll in your household, you could put more meringue on there. But I thought that amount was perfect, and there's plenty left, which I suppose you could eat. But this is our beautiful bourbon sweet potato with marshmallow meringue pie. And sweet potato pie is one of those things that just goes down in history. So let's give it a try.
That's really good.
Wow, that is the best pie I've ever had.
So sweet potato pie is definitely part of the African American history, and I'm glad we're able to enjoy it today and that our ancestors learned how to use sweet potatoes in place of yams. Thank you for joining me today. Bon appetit.